The courthouse steps felt cold beneath my feet, even through my expensive Italian leather shoes. I stood there, adjusting my charcoal suit jacket, watching the media swarm gather like vultures around fresh carrion. 18 months ago, I would have never imagined myself here. Not as the defendant in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, not as the reluctant heir to a fortune, and certainly not face-to-face with the two people who had taught me that love was conditional and family was a luxury I couldn't afford. My name is Marcus Chen, and this is the story of how my parents abandoned me at 10 years old, only to return 23 years later with lawyers and a lawsuit for $18 million, and how I made them regret every single day they chose to forget I existed. December 15th, 2001. I remember the date because it was exactly 1 week before my 11th birthday, and I had been counting down the days with the desperate hope that only a child can muster. My parents, David and Linda Chen, had been fighting for months. Not the normal kind of married couple arguments about bills or household chores, but the vicious, soul-destroying battles that leave emotional shrapnel embedded in everyone within earshot. According to YouTube analytics, 99.5% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. I was 10 years old, small for my age, with thick glasses and a stutter that grew worse whenever I was nervous, which was constantly in those days. My father worked in tech, back when that meant something different than it does now, and my mother was a real estate agent who spent more time perfecting her smile for clients than she ever did looking at me with genuine warmth. They called it a temporary arrangement. My father's brother, Uncle Tommy, lived in a modest 2-bedroom house in Oakland, worked as a mechanic, and had never married. He was the black sheep of the Chen family, the one who chose grease under his fingernails over stock portfolios, who drove a beat-up Ford pickup instead of a leased BMW, who watched baseball on Sunday afternoons instead of attending networking events. "Just until we figure things out," my mother had said, her perfectly manicured hand resting on my shoulder with all the warmth of a business handshake. "Uncle Tommy will take good care of you and will call every day." They didn't call every day. They didn't call every week. By the time I turned 11, they had moved to Singapore for my father's job. By the time I turned 12, they had stopped sending birthday cards. By the time I turned 13, I had stopped expecting them. Uncle Tommy never made excuses for them. He never said they were coming back, or that they missed me, or that they were just going through a rough patch. He simply absorbed me into his life like I had always belonged there, teaching me to change oil and throw a curveball, helping me with homework at his kitchen table, and showing me what unconditional love actually looked like. "Your parents made their choice, Marcus," he told me one evening when I was 16 and had just received news that they were having another child, a daughter they would name Sophie, who would grow up knowing her parents' love in a way I never had. But that doesn't define your worth. You hear me? That's their failure, not yours. Uncle Tommy was the one who taught me to drive, who attended my high school graduation, who co-signed my student loans when I got into UC Berkeley. He was the one who celebrated when I graduated summa cum laude with degrees in computer science and business, who cheered when I landed my first job at a promising startup, and who quietly beamed with pride as I climbed the corporate ladder with a determination that bordered on obsession. I had learned early that the only person I could truly count on was myself, and Uncle Tommy, who had proven that family wasn't about blood, but about showing up. By the time I turned 30, I had everything my parents had claimed to value: wealth, status, and success. The startup I had joined at 22 had gone public, and my stock options had made me wealthy beyond anything I had imagined as that scared 10-year-old boy. I had founded my own company, Chen Digital Solutions, which specialized in helping traditional businesses transition to digital platforms. Within 5 years, we had clients across 3 continents and revenue that made my father's old tech salary look like pocket change. I lived in a penthouse in San Francisco, drove cars that cost more than most people's houses, and wore watches that could fund a small nonprofit. But success, I learned, was a peculiar thing. It attracted attention from unexpected places, including from people who had once found it easy to forget you existed. My parents had kept loose tabs on me through Uncle Tommy, who had maintained a relationship with my father despite everything. Tommy never hid these conversations from me, and he never encouraged them either. "Your dad asks about you sometimes," he would say, with the emotional neutrality of someone commenting on the weather. "I tell him you're doing well." I never asked what my father's response was. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Uncle Tommy died on a Tuesday in March, 3 months after his 68th birthday. It was sudden, a massive heart attack while he was working under the hood of Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick. One moment he was humming an old Johnny Cash song, the next he was gone. I found him. I had stopped by after work to grab dinner with him, something we did twice a week without fail. I used my key to let myself in when he didn't answer the door, calling out his name as I walked through the house that had been my real childhood home. I saw his feet first, sticking out from under the car in the driveway, perfectly still in a way that Uncle Tommy never was. The funeral was small. Uncle Tommy had been well loved in his neighborhood, but he hadn't been a man who collected acquaintances or maintained professional networks. There were his co-workers from the shop, neighbors, who had known him for decades, Mrs. Patterson, who sobbed inconsolably, and me, and, to my shock, my parents. They stood at the back of the funeral home, looking like successful professionals who had accidentally wandered into the wrong event. My father wore an expensive suit that probably cost more than Uncle Tommy spent on clothes in a year. My mother had aged well, clearly the beneficiary of good genetics, better skincare, and minimal stress. Between them stood a young woman who looked to be in her early 20s, with my mother's delicate features and my father's stubborn chin. Sophie, my half-sister, the child they had kept. I didn't speak to them that day. I delivered Uncle Tommy's eulogy, accepted condolences from people who had actually known him, and watched my parents hover at the periphery like tourists observing local customs they didn't understand. After the service, my father approached me. He looked older than I expected, with gray threading through his black hair and new lines around his eyes. But his posture still radiated the confidence of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "Marcus," he said, extending his hand as if we were meeting for the first time. "I'm sorry for your loss." He was a good man. I stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment before turning away. Yes, he was. He was the best man I ever knew. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Uncle Tommy had been more financially savvy than anyone realized. The modest mechanic who lived in a 2-bedroom house and drove a pickup truck had been quietly investing for decades. He owned the auto shop where he worked, 3 rental properties, and had a stock portfolio that would have impressed my father. More importantly, he had purchased a lottery ticket every week for 40 years, always playing the same numbers, birthdays and anniversaries of people he cared about. 3 weeks before his death, those numbers had finally hit. The jackpot was $32 million. After taxes and the lump sum payout, Uncle Tommy's estate was worth approximately $18.2 million, and he had left every penny to me. I sat in the lawyer's office, staring at documents that felt surreal. Robert Sterling, Uncle Tommy's attorney for the past 15 years, was a soft-spoken man with kind eyes who had clearly thought highly of my uncle. He updated his will 6 months ago, Sterling explained. He was very specific about his intentions. He wanted to ensure you were provided for, and he wanted to establish a scholarship fund in your name for children in foster care. The scholarship fund was classic Uncle Tommy, taking care of kids who, like me, had been abandoned by the people who were supposed to love them unconditionally. "There's one more thing," Sterling said, sliding another document across his desk. "He left letters. One for you and—" He paused, looking uncomfortable. "One for your parents." Uncle Tommy's letter to me was 4 pages of his careful handwriting, telling me how proud he was, how much I meant to him, and how he hoped the inheritance would give me the freedom to live on my own terms rather than always running from my past. The letter to my parents was shorter, much shorter. "David and Linda, Marcus turned out better than either of you deserved. You threw away the best thing that ever happened to your family. Don't you dare try to take from him what you never earned." Tommy, 2 days later, my parents filed a lawsuit claiming that Uncle Tommy had been suffering from dementia, that he had been unduly influenced, and that as his closest blood relatives, they were entitled to the majority of his estate. The papers were served to me at my office by a courier who looked apologetic about the whole thing. I read through the legal language with growing disbelief and rage. They weren't just claiming the money, they were attacking Uncle Tommy's character, suggesting he had been mentally incompetent, painting him as a confused old man who had been manipulated by his ungrateful nephew. That's when I decided they needed to learn what revenge actually looked like. I didn't hire just any lawyer. I hired Catherine Morrison, the most ruthless family law attorney in California, a woman whose reputation for destroying opponents in court was matched only by her meticulous attention to detail. She was expensive, $800 an hour, but she was worth every penny. "This is a weak case," Morrison told me during our first meeting, reviewing my parents' lawsuit with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a tumor. "They're arguing dementia without medical evidence, undue influence without proof, and making a blood relative claim against an estate that was clearly and legally bequeathed. But family court can be unpredictable, especially when there are large sums involved." "I don't want to just win," I told her. "I want them to understand what it feels like to lose everything that matters to them." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "That's not typically how estate law works, Mr. Chen." "Then we expand our scope." Over the next 3 months, I became intimately familiar with my parents' lives in ways I had never wanted to be. They lived in an expensive suburb of Singapore, in a house that was worth approximately $3 million. My father was now a senior executive at a multinational tech firm. My mother ran a boutique real estate agency catering to expat families. Sophie was a senior at the International School of Singapore, with plans to attend Stanford in the fall. They had built a comfortable, successful life, a life that had no room for the son they had abandoned. But success, as I knew well, could be fragile. I hired a private investigator named James Wong, a former Singapore police detective who specialized in corporate investigations. Within 6 weeks, Wong had uncovered a pattern of financial irregularities at my father's company, kickbacks from vendors inflated, expense reports, and the use of company resources for personal travel. Nothing that would land him in prison, but more than enough to end his career and damage his reputation permanently. My mother's real estate agency was built on relationships with expat families, many of whom worked for the same companies and moved in the same social circles. A whisper campaign about unethical practices, hidden fees, and misrepresented properties would destroy her client base within months. But the investigation uncovered something else, something that made my hands shake when I read Wong's report. 3 years earlier, When Sophie was applying to universities, my parents had been struggling financially. My father's previous company had gone through layoffs, and he had been unemployed for 8 months. They had taken out a second mortgage on their house, maxed out their credit cards, and borrowed money from friends to maintain their lifestyle while he searched for a new position. During that time, they had learned about Uncle Tommy's lottery win through a mutual acquaintance. They had contacted him, asking for a loan, $50,000 to help with Sophie's education expenses. Uncle Tommy had refused, not because he was cruel or selfish, but because he knew they would never pay it back, and because he understood that giving them money would be enabling their continued rejection of the son they had abandoned. He had told them that if they wanted his help, they needed to rebuild their relationship with me first. They had hung up on him and never called back. Until his death made headlines in the local papers, complete with details about his unexpected lottery fortune and the nephew who would inherit everything. The legal proceedings had been dragging on for 6 months when my parents decided to fly to San Francisco for a face-to-face meeting. They brought Sophie with them, a calculated move designed to humanize them, to remind me that they were a family with a daughter who needed support. We met at Morrison's office on a Friday afternoon in October. My parents looked older than they had at Uncle Tommy's funeral, worn down by months of legal fees and stress. Sophie was beautiful in the way that 22-year-old women often are, with long black hair and intelligent eyes that reminded me painfully of my own at that age. "Marcus," my mother began, her voice carrying the same patronizing tone I remembered from childhood. "We need to talk about this situation reasonably. We're family, and families shouldn't be fighting like this." I leaned back in my chair, studying the three of them. Family. That's an interesting word choice, Linda. She flinched at the use of her first name. "I'm still your mother." "No," I said calmly. "You're the woman who gave birth to me and then decided I was too inconvenient to keep. There's a difference." My father cleared his throat. "Look, Marcus, we know we made mistakes." "Mistakes?" I interrupted. "You abandoned, 10-year-old child. You moved halfway around the world and started a new family while pretending your first child didn't exist. Those weren't mistakes, David. Those were choices." Sophie spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but steady. "I didn't know about you until last year." That admission hung in the air like a physical presence. For 22 years, my parents had managed to erase me so completely from their lives that their daughter, my half-sister, hadn't even known I existed. "Of course you didn't," I said, "because acknowledging me would have required them to acknowledge what they did." "We were young," my mother said, her composure cracking slightly. "We were struggling financially, our marriage was falling apart, and we thought—" "You thought it would be easier to start over without me," I finished. "And it was, wasn't it? Much easier to build a perfect family when you weren't dealing with the messy reality of the child you had damaged." My father leaned forward, his jaw tightening in a way I remembered from my childhood. "We're prepared to settle. 50-50 split. You keep $9 million, we get $9 million. Everyone walks away. I laughed, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. "You think this is about money?" "Isn't it?" Sophie asked, and for the first time I heard an edge in her voice. "You have more money than you could spend in a lifetime. We're asking for half of an inheritance from a man who was our family too." "Your family." I stood up, my careful composure finally cracking. "Uncle Tommy was never your family. He was the man who stepped in when your parents decided I was disposable. He was the man who taught me to drive, who came to my graduation, who celebrated my successes and comforted me through my failures. He earned the right to call me family. What did you ever do to earn it?" The room fell silent. Morrison watched the exchange with professional interest, making notes on her legal pad. "This isn't just about the money," I continued, my voice steady again. "This is about consequences. For 23 years, you've lived with the comfortable fiction that abandoning me was a reasonable choice that worked out for everyone. You've never had to face what you did or who you really are. That ends now." I walked to Morrison's desk and picked up a thick folder that Wong had delivered that morning. "David, did you know that your company has a zero-tolerance policy for financial irregularities? I have documentation of 17 separate incidents over the past 3 years where you've violated that policy." I dropped the first stack of papers on the conference table. "Your termination will be effective within the week." My father's face went white. "You can't." "Linda, your real estate license is contingent on ethical business practices. I have testimony from 6 clients about misrepresented properties and hidden fees." Another stack of papers joined the first. "The licensing board will be very interested in this information." My mother was gripping the edge of the table. "Marcus, please." "And Sophie," I said, turning to my half-sister, who was staring at me with a mixture of horror and fascination. "Your parents borrowed money from 3 different friends to pay for your Stanford tuition, money they can't pay back. When their incomes disappear, those friends are going to want their money. Your education fund is going to evaporate." I sat back down, feeling strangely empty now that the words were out in the open. "But here's what really happened," I continued. 3 years ago, when you were struggling financially, you found out about Uncle Tommy's lottery win. You called him asking for money, $50,000 to help with Sophie's education. He said no, but not because he was cruel. He said no because he told you that if you wanted his help, you needed to fix your relationship with me first. You hung up on him and never spoke to him again." Sophie turned to look at her parents, and I could see the exact moment when she realized I was telling the truth. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew about Marcus, and you knew Uncle Tommy would have helped us if you had just—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "So let me be clear about what happens next," I said. "You can withdraw this lawsuit and disappear from my life forever. I'll still destroy your careers and your finances, but I'll make sure Sophie's education is protected. Or you can continue with this legal fight, and I'll expand my campaign to include every aspect of your lives until you have nothing left but the memory of the son you threw away." The silence stretched on for nearly a minute. Finally, my father spoke. "You've become a vindictive, cruel person, Marcus." I smiled, and I knew it didn't reach my eyes. "I learned from the best." They withdrew the lawsuit the following Monday, but I didn't stop. Over the next 6 months, I watched their carefully constructed life collapse with the methodical precision of a controlled demolition. My father lost his job exactly as I had predicted, terminated for financial irregularities that had been overlooked until someone brought them to the company's attention. My mother's real estate license was suspended pending investigation, and her client base evaporated as word spread through Singapore's tight-knit expat community. They had to sell their house, liquidate their assets, and move into a modest apartment. The friends who had loaned them money began demanding repayment they couldn't provide. Their social circle, built on success and status, melted away as quickly as morning fog. Sophie's Stanford dreams crumbled along with her parents' finances. She had to withdraw her acceptance and find a job to help support her family. I monitored their downfall through monthly reports from Wong, reading each update with a satisfaction that felt increasingly hollow. I had gotten my revenge, had made them understand what it felt like to lose everything. That mattered. But victory, I discovered, was a cold comfort. The turning point came 8 months after they had withdrawn the lawsuit. Sophie sent me an email. Marcus, I know you have no reason to care about my opinion, but I wanted you to know that I understand what my parents did to you was unforgivable. I've spent the last year learning about the brother I never knew I had, and I'm ashamed that it took losing everything for me to see who they really are. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for money. I just wanted you to know that you were right about everything, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. I also wanted you to know that our father cries sometimes. I've caught him looking at old photos of you from when you were little. I think he knows what he lost, even if he'll never admit it. Our mother is different now, smaller somehow, like she's finally facing who she really is and doesn't like what she sees. I know this doesn't change anything, and I know you don't owe me anything, but I hope someday you might want to know your sister. Not because we share parents, but because I think we might understand each other. Sophie. I read the email 3 times before closing my laptop and walking to my window, looking out at the San Francisco skyline that had become the backdrop to my success and my revenge. Uncle Tommy's voice echoed in my memory. Your parents made their choice, Marcus. But that doesn't define your worth. I had spent so much energy proving my worth through success, and then so much more energy making my parents pay for their choices, that I had forgotten the most important lesson Uncle Tommy had taught me. The best revenge against people who abandon you isn't destruction. It's living a life so full of love and purpose that their absence becomes irrelevant. I met Sophie for coffee on a Tuesday morning in December, almost exactly 2 years after Uncle Tommy's death. She was working at a bookstore in Singapore, had enrolled in community college, and was planning to transfer to a 4-year university when her finances stabilized. She looked like me in ways that were startling, the same stubborn chin, the same habit of pushing hair back when thinking, the same way of tilting her head when listening intently. "I don't want anything from you," were the first words she spoke when she sat down across from me in the small cafe near her apartment. "I just wanted to meet my brother." We talked for 3 hours, about Uncle Tommy, about our parents, about the life I had built and the dreams she was rebuilding. She was intelligent, resilient, and possessed a strength that reminded me painfully of myself at her age. "They're different now," she told me when I asked about our parents. "Not better, necessarily, but smaller, like they've finally realized what they lost." "Do they talk about me?" "Sometimes. Our father more than our mother. I think he wants to reach out, but he doesn't know how. And I think he's afraid of what you might say." I could have told her that he was right to be afraid. I could have told her about the detailed plans I still had for making their lives even more difficult, the additional evidence Wong had gathered, the ways I could continue to punish them for their choices. Instead, I found myself saying, "What would Uncle Tommy want me to do?" Sophie smiled, and for the first time, I could see the family resemblance as something positive rather than painful. "I think he'd want you to be happy," she said. "Really happy, not just successful." After she left, I sat in the cafe for another hour, thinking about happiness and success and the difference between justice and revenge. That evening, I called Morrison and instructed her to cease all ongoing investigations into my parents. I called Wong and terminated his services. I deleted the files full of evidence and ammunition I had been collecting for future campaigns. And then I did something I hadn't done in 2 years. I donated money, a lot of money. I established the Tommy Chen Foundation with an initial endowment of $10 million, dedicated to helping children in foster care and providing scholarships for kids who had been abandoned by their families. The remaining $8 million from Uncle Tommy's inheritance would go into a trust fund, with the interest supporting the foundation's work in perpetuity. I kept the money I had earned through my own success, But Uncle Tommy's windfall would go toward helping kids like I had been, kids who needed to know that being abandoned didn't define their worth. 2 months later, Sophie moved to San Francisco to attend UC Berkeley. I helped her find an apartment and co-signed her lease, and we began building the sibling relationship that our parents' choices had stolen from us 23 years earlier. My parents sent me a letter through Sophie. It was 3 pages long, full of apologies and explanations, and requests for forgiveness that felt both genuine and insufficient. They wanted to rebuild our relationship, to find some way to make amends for their choices. I never responded, not because I hadn't forgiven them. Somewhere in the process of watching their lives crumble and then rebuilding my relationship with Sophie, I had let go of the anger that had consumed me. But forgiveness, I learned, didn't require reconciliation. I could let go of my need for revenge without inviting them back into my life. They had made their choice when I was 10 years old. I was making mine now. The Tommy Chen Foundation held its first fundraising gala on what would have been Uncle Tommy's 70th birthday. Sophie helped me plan it, and she was the one who suggested we include a memory wall where people could share stories about the father figures who had stepped up when their biological parents had stepped away. I stood at the podium that night, looking out at a room full of successful adults who had been abandoned children, foster, parents who had opened their hearts, and mentors who had changed lives simply by showing up. My Uncle Tommy never had children of his own, I told the crowd, but he raised me and loved me and taught me that family isn't about blood. It's about choosing to show up every day for the people who matter. Tonight, we're not just honoring his memory, we're celebrating every person who ever stepped up for a child who needed them. After the speeches and presentations, Sophie and I walked out onto the hotel's terrace, looking out at the San Francisco Bay. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if they had kept you?" she asked. I considered the question seriously. Sometimes. But then I think about Uncle Tommy, and I realize that maybe being abandoned was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because it didn't hurt, it did, terribly, but because it led me to someone who loved me unconditionally. And it taught me that the people who choose to stay in your life matter more than the people who choose to leave. Even if the people who left were your parents, especially then. We stood there in comfortable silence, brother and sister, connected not by the parents who had failed us both in different ways, but by our choice to build something new together. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, my heart stopped, thinking it might be from our parents. Instead, it was from one of the kids in our mentorship program, a 15-year-old named David, whose parents had abandoned him when he was 8. "Mr. Chen, I just wanted to say, thank you for everything. I got accepted to Berkeley for early admission. I couldn't have done it without the foundation's help. I promise I'll make you proud." I showed the message to Sophie, who smiled with tears in her eyes. "Uncle Tommy would have loved this," she said. "Yeah," I agreed. "He would have." As we walked back inside, I realized that revenge had taught me something important. Destroying the people who hurt you doesn't heal the wound they created. But choosing to love the people who show up for you, choosing to become the person who shows up for others, that's how you transform pain into purpose. My parents had abandoned me when I was 10 years old, and they had come back 23 years later to try to take from me what they had never earned. I had made them pay for their choices, had shown them what loss really felt like. But in the end, the greatest revenge was this. I had become someone Uncle Tommy would be proud of, someone who used wealth and success to lift up other abandoned children, someone who had learned that the opposite of abandonment isn't revenge, it's love. And unlike my parents, I had learned to choose love every single day. The lawsuit was over. The revenge was complete. But the real victory, building a life defined by love rather than loss, was just beginning.